Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I hope you're well, I hope you're rested, and I hope you've got a good bottle of spatchka next to you for this week's instalment, as we're taking a look into the latest episode from Star Wars Andor. This week, we were graced with the fourth entry from its first season, and if I could sum it up ultimately with two words, and I think these words are probably the best examples of how I felt about this week. Uneventful, but conflicting. This episode wasn't lacking any less in importance, as it was clearly still moving in the direction of whatever the plot is going to be for this season. However, I think it's fair to say that ultimately nothing happened, but we did get something from this. The problem, however, is that this series has been positioned at a point in the timeline that has already been explored. Now, that's not to say that you can't have other shows or other books or anything like that explore the same time period within the Star Wars timeline, particularly that 19-year period between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. There is a question, for me at least, around the significance and the importance of this show, as it lands exactly within the 5-year period before the Battle of Yavin, which, if you're unaware, takes place at the same time as the Star Wars animated series Rebels, which is also canon, takes place 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, and does a lot of world building within the final two seasons to set up events that will later happen in Rogue One and A New Hope. The show even went to the extent of bringing in characters that have been featured in this series and will be featured, like Mon Mothma and Saw Gerrera, and even sets up certain events that will happen in Rogue One by name of Director Krennic, and even to the point of introducing us to the crystal that will be part of the Death Star. Now, Rebels managed to achieve that in a short space of 4 seasons over a period of 5 years within its actual production timeline. But Andor only has 2 to explain what it's trying to do and what it wants to do. But one could argue, obviously, that where Rebels was designed to be more of a fun, epic space adventure, Andor is trying to become a more grounded, gritty, realistic, relatable journey, focused on one character, whilst introducing a bunch of side characters that could potentially play different roles later down the line. The more gritty approach in this certainly sets itself aside from Rebels, but what else does this show need to do to set itself aside from what Rebels did? Because right now, this latest episode sets up the events that will presumably pay off in the next episode, or episode 6 potentially, in a heist needs to happen to obtain a armory from robbing a garrison of Imperials on the world of Aldhani. And we saw plenty of these heist moments happen within Star Wars Rebels. There was very little in that sense to set them apart. Differences obviously with Andor is that it is from a live action perspective, Rebels is from an animated perspective. You could do a lot more adventurous and outlandish stuff within that series compared to what you could do in Andor. So the question is, if Rebels filled out a good portion of this timeline, why is Andor here? What do we need Andor for? What is it here to do? Right now, at least, it's certainly taking things from a more political aspect and a more realistic approach on how a lot of people felt about the Empire and how they were dealing with it and the early stages of the rebellion. Rebels, however, did the same thing, but from a more outlandish approach. Obviously, they had 2 Jedi as part of the main crew. They had different species with varying abilities like Zeb, and they brought in a lot of returning characters from the Clone Wars, like Ahsoka, who was another Jedi, Captain Rex, who was a military commander within the Clone Wars, had a great deal of experience behind him. And eventually, Rebels, as I said, introduced Saw Gerrera and Mon Mothma to his story. And it did it in a meaningful way that actually furthered some of the plot to both the movies and the series itself. But right now, Andor has introduced Mon Mothma in this episode, and really there was very little that came off it. except for telling us what we already knew with Mon Mothma's story, is that obviously she's being monitored by the Imperials because of presumed rebel activity on her part, and we're starting to meet more of the people that she's connected with and understand exactly what it is that she's having to do to keep that hidden. But aside from that, so far, we've really had nothing added to this show. It's obviously been more world building, more character development, but there's just nothing happening in this week's episode, which is bizarre to say because the first 3 episodes, in retrospect, apart from episode 3 for the fight scenes that it had, very little happened in them either, but yet they were also enjoyable. And I'm hoping that it does something that truly defines its reason for being here. Because right now, we've gotten some really good insights to Andor as a character, to some of the side characters that have been introduced now. But beyond that, there's been no real overarching plot, no real overarching thread. Obviously, we could say that, well, we know where it's going to end with Rogue One, but the series itself can't just be entirely set up. There needs to be elements of payoff, there needs to be moments that truly justify its existence right now. And I know that we're only on the 4th episode, so I'm going to reserve my judgment entirely until I've seen the entire season, but I do like to do the week to weeks to at least, I guess, compile a series of notes that I can look back on and say, well, now that's been explained, or that didn't work, or they didn't do anything over this. So far, I think this week's episode, as I said at the start, was uneventful, but also fairly conflicting because it did offer up content, just not what I kind of assumed it would. So I guess that's on me, and I need to kind of temper my expectations a little bit. Fair enough. But you can only have so much time to set up before you have to pay off. And I'm hoping that, at least by the midway point of the season, we get some idea of maybe a looming threat. Obviously, we've got the ISB, the Imperial Security Bureau, that were introduced in this episode, as well as actually having a full environment and offices that they work from, and getting a full understanding for what their roles actually are in the universe. But if it's just going to be the ISB, I wouldn't really say that that's a compelling threat right now. Maybe some internal conflict within the rebellion that seemed to kind of be set up a little bit in this one could be an interesting way to go and give Andor a bit more of a reason for his distrust when we get to Rogue One. But I don't know. I feel that right now it's refreshing. It's nice to just have more Star Wars content on our screens, but I'm not feeling its purpose at the moment, which I'm not going to rip on it completely for, given that it is literally in its 4th episode of a 12-episode season. So again, I'll hold off my judgments entirely of the series until it's concluded, but so far the first 3 episodes were impressive as a whole arc, but episode 4 on its own so far, and I'm hoping episode 5 and 6 will obviously pay off what they set up in this one, but I'm hoping that it has some direction. I'm hoping that it has an intention, and it's not just going to be feeling like we're just going through the motions week to week. I want to feel like we have an end game to this that isn't Rogue One. That said, though, there was still a little bit of information that came out of this week's episode, some of which could be connecting directly to events that take place within Rebels, which would be fascinating to see, offer up a little more connective tissue than just Dave Filoni continually trying to remind audiences that Rebels and Clone Wars do exist. But other than that, there was just oddly nothing to unpack this week. There's obviously a lot of character motivations and movements that are set up. There's a good understanding for what everyone's position is in all this, but that's not really something that I can spoil or talk about necessarily, because it would work better if you watch it, essentially, if you have that viewing experience. That's going to do it for this week's episode, though, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. If you liked this video, please definitely shoot that like button in the face, and then leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of this week's episode. Was it a colossal disappointment or was it a great inclusion for you? I want to hear it. And also consider subscribing, as I will be reviewing Andor. I'll be reviewing Tales of the Jedi, The Bad Batch when that comes in January, and I'll even be, unfortunately, continuing She-Hulk for the next 3 weeks. So make sure you come back tomorrow and check out last week's videos for She-Hulk and Andor, respectively. Until then, everybody, have a great day, have a good rest of the week, and may the Force be with you.